Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Rebecca Vilchavez. I'm President and CEO of the Inter-American Dialogue, and it's such a pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion on China's Global Security Initiative and what it means for Latin America and the Caribbean. As Beijing sharpens its security messaging in the region, most recently, we saw this in Xi Jinping's remarks at the China-CELAC Forum. This morning's conversation couldn't be more timely. 3 years after its launch, the Global Security Initiative, China's effort to offer an alternative to the US-led security framework, is starting to come into clearer focus. Through the GSI, China appears to be positioning itself not just as an economic partner, but increasingly as a security partner, emphasizing principles like national sovereignty and non-interference. So today we're going to have the chance to go beyond the headlines to explore how GSI fits into China's broader approach to Latin America and the Caribbean. Is it merely rhetorical positioning or the beginning of a longer-term strategy that could reshape the region's security architecture? I served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Western Hemisphere from 2013 to 2016. And at that time, Chinese security engagement was deliberately low profile. Of course, we were tracking other forms of Chinese security cooperation in the region, but one of the most visible elements at that time was Chinese training and military exchange programs, including paid travel for military and police personnel to travel to China, a very powerful form of soft power. Has this changed? What does the Global Security Initiative mean when it comes to other forms of engagement, such as CN, counter-narcotics assistance, Chinese arms sales, and the export of surveillance technology? And what does this mean for US policy? So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Margaret Myers, who leads the Dialogue's Asia and Latin America program and is a pioneer in analyzing China's evolving role in the region. And Margaret will introduce the panelists and moderate today's discussion. Thank you again for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca, for that excellent framing and also for the introduction. As Rebecca mentioned, I am Margaret Myers, Senior Advisor to the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue, and I just want to thank you all for joining us today for this very timely event. The GSI, the Global Security Initiative, is one of three global initiatives alongside the GDI, right, the Global Development Initiative, and also the Global Civilization Initiative that China has proposed, all of three of which China has proposed in recent years, and which appear to complement broader Belt and Road related activities. These initiatives offer a view from China of how to achieve possible solutions to major challenges pertaining to peace and development for humanity, right, as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs describes it. And the GSI itself, as Rebecca referenced and as we've seen in many documents, right, interprets security in the broadest of terms. These global initiatives continue to be referenced in high-level engagements with the region, including recent reference, as Rebecca mentioned, to the GSI during the China-CELAC Forum just a few months back. But, an understanding of the ways in which the GSI is manifesting across the region and across other regions will require further research and analysis. There's also really a need to understand local interpretations of the GSI and how definitions of this and the other global initiatives may be shifting among Beijing's policy circles. So to help us interpret these and other developments, we are very fortunate to have an all-star group of experts with us here today. Carla Freeman is Senior Lecturer for International Affairs and Director of the Foreign Policy Institute at the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, SAIS. Carla and I had the opportunity to look into the GSI in some depth during our time at the U.S. Institute of Peace, where I was a senior advisor for a time and which was originally a co-host of this event. André Serbin-Pont is director of the regional think tank CRIES, the Coordinadora Regional de Investigaciones Económicas y Sociales, also regional representative for the Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, and a full professor at Universidad del Salvador. Xiaoyu Pu is an associate professor of political science at the University of Nevada, Reno, and also a former non-resident senior fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue. And then finally, last but not least, of course, Brian Fonseca is director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy and an adjunct professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Florida International University. He's also the founding executive director of the interdisciplinary program Cybersecurity at FIU. So these experts will each provide some views and observations, and then we'll move into a Q&A session. If you have questions for the panel, please send them at any moment in the session using the Zoom Q&A function that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. And so with that, I'll turn it over to our first panelist. Carla, I wonder if you could get us started, especially, perhaps providing some understanding of given your vast experience with analysis of the GSI, of how this particular initiative is translating globally and what we can understand from its manifestation in the Latin American context.
Well, thank you, Margaret, for the wonderful introduction. And it's an honor to join my fellow panelists and to be invited by Inter-American Dialogue this morning to talk about the GSI. Before I offer some background on GSI, I just want to underscore a point you made, Margaret, and acknowledge that a lot of my research on the Global Security Initiative was done thanks to the United States Institute of Peace, where I was a senior expert for nearly 4 years before returning to CICE earlier this year. I was fortunate to partner with USIP contractor Bates Gill, who's at NBR, and also some talented younger experts, including Alex Stevenson, now at the State Department, and Allison McFarland, now a PhD student at Princeton, in this research. And as you mentioned, Margaret, I'd really looked forward to deepening my work with you on Latin America while at USIP. So I just want to acknowledge USIP's important role in paving the way for me to learn more about this important initiative. And I should say that at USIP, my focus was on Southeast Asia, Central Asia, and started to do some research on the GSI in Africa. So today I'll look at GSI more in global and comparative context. But as Rebecca observed, GSI has now been around for about 3 years as a public idea. Xi Jinping, China's leader Xi Jinping, announced the GSI at the Boao Forum in April 2022. And at that time, many people dismissed it as a diplomatic rhetoric. It seemed like a pretty fuzzy idea. But 3+ years later, we can see the GSI becoming really a concrete organizing framework that China is using to deepen security cooperation, particularly across the global south, and to promote its image as a provider of global security public goods. So I'll try to make 3 main points about GSI by way of background for our discussion today. First, GSI really does represent quite a shift in how China is approaching international security. It's moving from an economic first engagement with countries around the world to increasingly security, if not security centric, into partnerships that include security as an important dimension. Second, while the GSI is manifesting very differently across regions, there are also some shared features in Beijing's approach across these regions, and it's certainly designed to expand China's influence in these regions. And third, as this initiative is gaining traction, I think it's important for the United States to recognize that it offers the United States an opportunity to identify new opportunities for US policy cooperation in the security arena with many of these countries in the global south. Some background on the GSI. First of all, you can see the GSI in the context of Chinese politics as part of an overarching sort of pivot toward security by Xi Jinping at home as well as abroad. Xi Jinping took power with this and introduced this idea of comprehensive or holistic security. And it's, as you mentioned, Margaret, it widens the concept of security beyond defense to encompass economic, technological, ecological, geopolitical, cultural dimensions of security. So the GSI encapsulates, or it sort of takes that, globalizes this holistic approach to security. And this is broader concept of security as part of a new emphasis on security promoted by Xi that makes development literally contingent on security. And this is a major departure from previous post-Mao Chinese leadership, which beginning with Deng really prioritized economic development. And now Xi has inverted that logic, now arguing that security has to come first, even saying security is a prerequisite for development. If you go back to understand GSI and its origins, its launch was deliberately designed. Timing of its launch at Boao in April 2022 was just 2 months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That was a time when strains were growing between China and the US and allies, intensifying globally. So that was quite strategic. And as the research that we did at USIP shows, GSI is both a rhetorical campaign, which is clearly aimed at widening support for China's global vision for security, but it's also an organizing framework that allows security actors across China's public party state system, Ministry of Public Security, and the PLA to deepen security cooperation across the global South, and also many other actors in the Chinese system. And if you want to really get into the weeds, you can see a lot of this laid out in Xi's Asia for Asia. Asians idea when he spoke in 2014 about how important it was for Asians to take their own security into their own hands. That was an effort to marginalize US influence in the Indo-Pacific, and the GSI essentially builds on that to challenge what Beijing, of course, labels US hegemony globally. And then finally, the GSI is now a part of China's 2023 foreign relations law. And so the GSI is actually codified in Chinese law as a formal goal and task of Chinese foreign policy. So it's much less fuzzy than it was 3.5 years ago. So how is China's GSI campaign in the Global South going so far, and what shape is it taking? And if you look across different regions, you'll see that China is very careful to tailor its global security initiative to the different needs and what it perceives as demand signals from different regions. So in Southeast Asia, for example, you'll see China focusing on non-traditional security challenges like cybercrime, money laundering, and so on. And it uses a mechanism there that it has established with some countries in the region, the Lancang-Mekong cooperation mechanism, to promote the GSI. In Central Asia, our research showed that China is working through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also a newer C5 plus China mechanism to try to engage Central Asian states on security cooperation and counterterrorism, and also countering external interference in Central Asian affairs. In Africa, they're similar to China's GSI cooperation, GSI formulation within CELAC. Beijing has promoted GSI through the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and emphasized issues of interest to African countries, from peacekeeping to counterterrorism cooperation, and referencing the GSI. China's also worked on Middle East peace and referenced the GSI in that region. And so I will leave it to the Latin American specialists on the panel to talk more about Latin America, but there are enormous opportunities. I think the actual number of countries in Latin America that have formally endorsed GSI are quite few. Maybe Nicaragua, Ecuador, and Uruguay, maybe perhaps Cuba. But I think, as we will certainly discuss shortly, China's made extensive investments that could lay potential groundwork for growing security cooperation. And you do see China providing a lot more policing, training, equipment, and so on, as well as, very important, I think, through safe cities programs, surveillance equipment, and so on. And then finally, just critically, I think China, that point made earlier, China is deliberately bypassing inter-American security institutions and instead trying to promote security cooperation through CELAC. So I think, the GSI is gaining traction around the world. And to my point about, I'm trying to make about enhanced US engagement, GSI really highlights that there are areas that the US may be missing where countries are thirsty for greater security cooperation. At the same time, research that I did with my partners in Southeast Asia and Central Asia showed that GSI has not diminished interest among countries in cooperating on security with the United States. And so I think the Trump administration's quite historic focus on Latin America, with Secretary Rubio's first trip being the first time in over 100 years the Secretary of State began his time in office with the Secretary of State with Latin America. I think that provides a compelling opening for greater cooperation. Oddly, maybe the GSI offers some new insights into what the region might want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carla, for that enormously helpful overview of the GSI's evolution and also comparative context, and a perfect segue into our next intervention. Andre, I wonder if you could, being there in the region, give us a sense of how Latin Americans are sort of viewing the GSI and how you see it manifesting in the region. I'd also be interested in your thoughts on, whether the China-CELAC Forum can be effectively leveraged, right, to articulate it or to advance any of this work. Certainly, China appears to have been frustrated in the past and with its ability to leverage that particular platform for policy purposes. But please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Sure, and thank you for the invitation. It's truly a pleasure to be here. And as I was thinking about your question and some of the ideas that I had for today, I'm going to apologize first off for being maybe a bit anecdotal, but I think there's some examples that will help us, reinforce what Carla just said, but also looking forward, how this might evolve into the future, right? And right now, I'm based in Buenos Aires, and we had Kristen Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security. She was in town yesterday. And I was talking to a colleague, and I was like, one of the interesting things is that the security protocol that the federal police has in these instances is that if anything were to happen, they're going to immediately deploy the HIF, which is one of the special forces units that the federal police has. And they're going to deploy and the Chinese armored vehicles that were donated to the federal police a few years back, right? And this is a type of engagement that we've been seeing from China over the last few years. And I think it has set the groundwork for how it's going to be moving forward, right? So maybe in Latin America, it's not that much of it's not news that they're engaging in the security sphere, maybe not so much in the military sphere. They are engaged in the military sphere as well, anyways. But these elements, help us better understand, where they've been trying to position themselves and how that's going to move forward. Another anecdote, and might be Argentine focused again. Last week, the Argentine army received its first lot of drones for Operación Roca. And yes, this sounds like military engagement, but Operación Roca is a border security operation that's going to be deployed to the north of Argentina, mostly on the border with Bolivia. The drones are, of course, DJI drones from China. And you say, well, but there was an open bid, right, to acquire these drones. Yes, there's 3 participants in that bid, the 3 importers of Chinese drones from DJI, right? So we start to see a pattern, right? They're positioning themselves in very good ways. We go to Vicente Lopez, it's north of here in the city of Buenos Aires, the municipality of Vicente Lopez. The mayor of Vicente Lopez is now the mayor of Buenos Aires. While he was in charge of Vicente Lopez, he bought all the security and command and control center for the security cameras in Vicente Lopez from Chinese companies. And that was a bit of a segue for many of these companies to come into Argentina, providing these types of services, right? And this is a pattern that we've seen, and we see it in other parts of the region. We look at ECU 911 in Ecuador and the financing provided by China for the acquisition of the technology that would be used in that centralized platform for security. We saw donations of equipment to Panama, to Dominican Republic, to Costa Rica, the emphasis and the coverage on cyber crime. And then depending on what country they're engaging with, also you start to see varying tints of, what they're willing to cooperate on. And I'll go to, an oldie but a goodie, Venezuela. When we look at Carnet de la Patria 7-8 years ago, who was the provider of the technology behind Carnet de la Patria, which is CTE, right? And that technological transfer and know-how was made only possible by China, and also a way for them to test out some of the technologies that they were developing in more of that social control sphere. So we clearly have engagement on both official and unofficial lanes in the security realm, and that's conditioned a lot of the governmental actors, because now, of course, you have set up infrastructure that you're going to want to build on rather than build new infrastructure. So that facilitates China having these positions. But then there's the bigger projects that I think have their impact that is at more of a strategic level as well, right? And last year, Southcom Commander Laura Richardson came down to Buenos Aires, to Argentina. Then she went south to Ushuaia and visited what's going to be one of the largest and most important ports in the region for projection into the South Atlantic, right? This is a key project for Argentina and its capabilities in the region, but also for its partners. So it made sense that the United States being present there and supporting a project of these characteristics, especially after years of debate on who was going to build it, because for years there was a lot of interest by the Chinese to build that port. There is interest by U.S. companies and other companies. In the end, Argentina is trying to finance it itself, which I think is a good way to go ahead. Although, we have certain financial restraints, which may make the project go a bit slower. But China didn't just make their bet at that time on the Ushuaia port. At the same time, they were negotiating with the governor, not the national government, the governor of Tierra del Fuego, a port 100 kilometers north in Rio Grande. $1.2 billion investment, also with a chemical plant and a lot of the infrastructure that would be valuable to have in Ushuaia, right? Which would have even made redundant the project of those characteristics. It sounds like they were willing not only to try and get into the Ushuaia port, but if that was impossible, make the Ushuaia port redundant by having their investment be successful first in that port, just 100 kilometers north, right? So I think that the challenge that we face there is that many of these initiatives, they're engaging either with the local or provincial governments, and that's something we see clearly in Argentina, especially with Brian. We've done a lot of work on the lithium sphere, and we always discussing, part of the challenge is that China has no problem to engage directly with governors. Argentina has a legislation that's perfectly set up for China or any other external actor to engage directly with provincial governors, because it's the provinces that are the owners of those mineral rights. So you have to compete under those terms, but also then, of course, that more indirect engagement, right? You sell the drones to the army, and of course it's an open bid, but there's only 3 companies offering drones, and they're all Chinese companies offering those drones. And these are going to be very impactful. They're going to be key aspect in monitoring operations on the border. They're going to be feeding information directly into the national intelligence system of Argentina. So I think that nowadays part of the challenge that countries like Argentina face is, even when they've positioned themselves in a stance in which they're saying, we are Western Hemisphere. We know who our partners are. We know it's the United States. We know it's Israel. We know it's the Western world in general. But at the same time, there's all these smaller instances which are really hard to control, in which Chinese presence continues to be strong. And at the same time, China is willing to take a step back in other instances. Last year, during the negotiations for the F-16 fighters that Argentina ended up buying, the competing offer was Chinese. And this is a good example of engagement on the military realm. It was for a good time. Well, when you start looking at the details, it turns out that as negotiations advanced and the F-16 offer was getting stronger and becoming more likely, Argentina said, hey, instead of 15 aircraft, would you be willing to sell us 18 aircraft of the Chinese-made aircraft? And the Chinese suddenly said no, which is strange, right? Usually the Chinese showed themselves as being more willing to offer more as long as they would get the contract. And they actually just ended up putting a lot of limitations on the type of weaponry they were willing to transfer, on the amount of aircraft. It almost sounds like they kind of threw the towel in there, and they know that contract was going to the United States. That wasn't the fight that was worth having. It was others. The intent is directed to other spaces, and I think that that's a key challenge, right? How do you deal with that from a Latin American perspective? And again, I'm sorry if I've been Argentine focused today. But I think that national governments, provincial governments have that challenge right now on how do you deal with these existing infrastructures that are going to be instrumentalized for pushing forward with this agenda into the future.
Thank you so much, Andre. It's an enormously helpful perspective, and these anecdotal examples, though anecdotal, right, really help us to understand the breadth and depth and multi-layered nature, right, of or leveled nature of Chinese engagement in the security space. So thank you so much for that intervention. Let's move on to Xiaoyu. Xiaoyu, I wonder if you could give us something of a perspective on how the GSI, as conceived now, aligns with China's broader security concepts and principles and foreign policy, right? What does it hope to achieve, and different from other approaches or visions of security cooperation, including that of the United States, in your view?
Okay, thank you. It's my great honor and pleasure to join this distinguished panelists to discuss GSI. I want to first, in response to Margaret's question, I want to first talk about the origin and evolution briefly of this concept. Then I want to talk about why does it matter, like this GSI, this concept, for us to understand China's foreign policy on the global stage. First, regarding the origin of this concept, although it's a relatively new concept, right? Originally proposed by Xi Jinping in 2022 at the Boao Forum in Asia. And is that really like a totally new bottle with new wine, or old bottle, old wine? So I think it's probably somewhere between. It's relatively new bottle with a half new wine. I would put that way, in a sense that even some of the ideas look like a very dramatic, right? China previously was very hesitating to talk about this kind of very high-profile global ideas. But this global security initiative at least have some earlier origin from 1990s. In late 1990s, the Chinese leaders, they talk about the idea about the so-called new security concept, because after the end of the Cold War, China faced very severe geopolitical challenges in East Asia. So at that point, they want to reassure neighboring countries and also try to propose some new ideas to overcome this kind of zero-sum Cold War style competition. So that was sort of the new security concept in late 1990s. But that concept primarily focused on East Asia and not a global concept. Second key moment of this evolution of global security concept was Xi Jinping in 2014. When China established the so-called National Security Commission or National State Security Commission, Xi Jinping also proposed the concept, the so-called holistic approach to national security. The Chinese called 总体安全观, holistic national security. That means security is redefined as a much broader concept, including not only traditional security, but non-traditional security, including both regime security and also traditional international security, including also economic, culture, and other domains. So provide a very a broad definition of security. So finally, 2022, Xi Jinping proposed this global security concept, as sort of like a further expansion of the security concept to the global on the global scale. So that's sort of when we think about global security concept, we might see this as some kind of evolution from late 1990s to current era, from regional focus in East Asia to global scale, and from a narrow definition of security to a broader definition of security. So that's how we understand global security concept. Second, what are the implications, right, for the Chinese foreign policy? I think the proposal of global security concept is shaped by China's repositioning on the global stage. Previously, it was a very low profile great power, primarily focused on issues in East Asia. But in the past 10 years, also maybe a slightly longer time, China has transformed from regional power or a great power with regional focus gradually to a global power. Initially in global trade, then global diplomacy. But now Xi Jinping also included security as part of China's global sort of foreign policy transformation or repositioning. I don't think the process has finished yet, right? So, but I think when we understand interpreted implication of China's global security concept, we need to understand China's repositioning from regional focus in East Asia to global implications. But in terms of the purposes or functions, I largely interpreted the global security initiative serves several functions. The first, I call that delegitimization in traditional security. That means this kind of concept, one of the purposes is to delegitimize American narrative about alliances politics, great power competition. So China labeled all these as so-called Cold War mentality. But on the other hand, I don't think China has a viable alternative to replace this kind of traditional security infrastructure, like alliances structure. China using global security concept to criticize American alliances system. But China is not emulating the United States to recreate a new alliances system. So it's kind of delegitimization without entirely new alternative. This is the first function. The second, I call that sort of like a status signaling. In terms of like as a rising power, China wants to signal its rising status. So the global security concept also provided some kind of framework so that maybe China want to provide more security public goods. So that as a rising power, if you want to increase your enhance your profile, you need to provide more secure international public goods, even in security domain. So I think this is the second function, status signaling, signaling a higher status through providing a framework, including providing potential security public goods. Whether that's an achievable goal, that's debatable. The third function, maybe it's a solidarity with the global south, at least some of the countries from the global south. So I see this kind of global security concept serve these multiple purposes. Again, whether China can achieve those goals, that's much more debatable. So finally, my final remarks is, so what, right? Well, what could we take from here? So I think when we evaluate the evolution of this concept, the implications for Chinese foreign policy, on the one hand, we need to think about China's growing profile in security domain certainly raise concerns for the United States and maybe also for some countries in Latin America. But also, I don't think we need to think about this as sort of exactly symmetrical competition with the United States. Maybe it's a asymmetrical competition. Maybe I put that way. So in that sense, this concept and its practices pose some challenges, but it's not exact the same kind of challenges as former Soviet Union versus the United States. We need to think about some kind of like this reality as well. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Xiaoyu. That's an enormously helpful framing as we begin to think through the differences, right, in what China is trying to achieve, and perhaps what the U.S. has sought to develop and promote in the region over time. And Brian, I think it makes sense to turn to you, given your vast experience both working with U.S. security, right, Latin American security, and also looking at the GSI and some depth to give us a sense of, really how you think China's conceptualization of security, the GSI itself, right, differs in substantive ways from what the U.S. is pursuing in the region from a security perspective.
Thanks, Margaret. First and foremost, thank you and the dialogue for the opportunity to share some thoughts. It's always a tough gig to go after some incredible thought leadership on the topic because I'll probably reinforce some of the things that were already said. And I'll start by reinforcing Xiaoyu's point about this being somewhat old wine sort of packaged in a new bottle. I might go a little further than half and say maybe 75%, but I think the point is still valid. That what China did was say to take the collective work that it was doing in the broad security environment and sort of frame it in a strategic way and sort of align it, more thoughtfully across its strategy from a domestic and foreign policy perspective. And I think that said, I still sort of view GSI as China's umbrella concept for reimagining this global security governance. And while it's framed rhetorically around indivisible security and win-win cooperation, I still strongly think in practice it really reflects an alternative to the US led security architecture. And it's one that fuses, as was pointed out, traditional security with policing, technology, proliferation, political influence in ways that I think really distinguish it from the United States. While I'm trying to still assess sort of GSI's direct operational impact in Latin America, and I've written on this in the past with folks like Leland Lazarus sort of looking at Chinese police engagement, I think the verdict is still out in terms of its operational impact. Nonetheless, I think Beijing has still shown it can deliver tangible security cooperation. And I think unlike the US, which faces, serious legal and political constraints on domestic security engagement, China operates with greater flexibility and far fewer restrictions. It's willing to provide policing support, install surveillance infrastructure, host security dialogues, even with politically unstable countries where US engagement is limited. For example, Ecuador's Chinese-built Safe City system integrated nationwide surveillance would not have been possible through U.S. security assistance channels or been far more difficult through traditional U.S. security assistance channels. So in comparing China's approach to the United States, I want to focus on three core distinctions that stand out to me. First, China's GSI puts far greater emphasis on law enforcement cooperation than I think the U.S. does. And that's not to say the U.S. isn't doing anything, and I'll talk about this here a bit more. But I think it's embedded itself through police training, surveillance technology, and even co-policing agreements around the world. And we've certainly seen that sort of unfold in the region as well. Second, Beijing works directly with provincial and municipal law enforcement, bypassing central governments in ways that the U.S. generally doesn't. And exploits local central government political divides, as Andre pointed out in the Ushuaia province of Argentina. And then third, China blurs the line between military and policing and what Xiaoyu referenced as a holistic security model, while the U.S. maintains pretty strict separations between the two, and those separations often reflect values of the United States. And so let me dig in a little bit more. So on the military versus law enforcement emphasis, U.S. security cooperation is largely or predominantly focused on mill-to-mill engagement, joint exercises, defense equipment sales, training programs like IMET via Department of Defense. Law enforcement cooperation exists via State Department's INL, and I know we have some State Department leadership in the audience today, and certainly State Department has done quite a bit of work in the INL space, FBI, DEA. But I think it's narrow in scope and typically focuses on sort of transnational crime, counter-narcotics, anti-terrorism, doesn't have the development model necessarily that was referenced earlier. Further, US training and engagement with foreign police forces is generally less pervasive and more regulated to avoid things like human rights abuses and sovereign territorial sovereignty issues, which is what makes it challenging for the US to go outside of the scope too far. And there are legal constraints in the US that sort of mandate that. On the other side, China's GSI approach heavily invests in law enforcement verticals, alongside sometimes even more so than traditional military engagement. It promotes co-policing agreements, including controversial overseas police service stations in sort of the global South, and at which China sort of advocates that it does so to largely serve its overseas ethnic Chinese communities. China exports safe city surveillance platforms through state-owned enterprises like Huawei and others, embedding Chinese technologies in local policing infrastructure. It brings foreign police officers to China for training and surveillance, ground control, and counter-protest tactics, often linked to China's domestic policing norms. And it focuses on institutionalizing dependency on Chinese policing methods and technology. And I think the implication for this is that China can cultivate influence environments where military cooperation is politically sensitive, giving it a non-military foothold in security governance in the region. The second is on the sort of national versus subnational engagement. Predominantly, the US works through central governments, and through central governments, it's able to negotiate at the national level and then implement downward. In democracies, US agencies rarely bypass central government authorities to work directly with provincial or municipal police. And I think that sometimes is reflected in the absence of US engagement on the ground at local levels because it hasn't been able to make its way through central governments. China's approach is different. It works directly with provincial and municipal law enforcement bodies, especially in developing and transitional states. It offers city-level cooperation agreements, tech deployments, and sister city policing programs. Now, the US also has sister city policing programs, but those are held sort of local to local, and it doesn't necessarily have tremendous equities from the federal government, or at least there's not a whole lot of alignment and connective tissue there. China exploits political and administrative rifts between local and central governments. A perfect example is what Andre pointed out in Ushuaia, where the Chinese engaged in the hopes of building a footprint in the southern part of Argentina to have sort of greater access in the South Atlantic. And when the US did engage, it engaged with the central government to try to put pressure on the provincial governor to back China out from having that strategic footprint as a sort of geopolitical competitive space in southern Argentina. And so China does really well at sort of exploiting or leveraging the political and administrative risks between local and central governments. And then lastly, they create these parallel channels of influence that can bypass central level oversight, central level government oversight, and or resistance in some cases. And I think the implication for this is that the subnational focus allows China to entrench itself in local law enforcement ecosystems, which are harder to dislodge than military ties, and less visible to national level diplomacy. And I say harder to dislodge because oftentimes sort of the change of central governments can change the sort of texture of US mill-to-mill engagement, for example, but at the local levels, it's far more difficult to dislodge. And Margaret, you've written in the past on the role in which China's engaged at sort of administrative levels below the state and how they've worked really hard to sort of deepen their ability to engage at local levels. And I think third, the holistic and blurred security sectors, which Xiaoyu pointed out as well. The US maintains clear distinction between military, policing, intelligence, and diplomatic functions. That's not to say that they're not integrated. That's not to say the United States has worked hard to try to ensure alignment across those. But the reality is we still have very clear distinctions between those functions. Military assistance and police assistance have separate funding, separate authorities, and separate operational cultures. This separation is partly legal, and is partly normative in the context of sort of how US conducts security assistance. On the other side, China's approach blurs the boundaries between military, paramilitary, and police, consistent with its domestic integrated security model. The People's Armed Police, for example, operates in a gray zone between military and law enforcement roles. Surveillance technology, counterterrorism, and public order tools are often framed as part of comprehensive national defense. And this allows law enforcement engagement to carry strategic weight similar to military partnerships. And I think the implication for this is that China's GSI offers a full spectrum security partnership in which law enforcement is inseparable from broader geopolitical alignment. And so I think there are four things that sort of spin out of this I think are really important, and then I'll wrap up. And I think the first is that Chinese law enforcement assistance often comes bundled with political expectations, support for Beijing's position on Taiwan or Hong Kong or Xinjiang. Nonetheless, that engagement is partly sort of incentivized by political interests from a foreign policy and domestic policy from China. Technology entrenchment. The safe city model creates long-term dependencies because recipient states must maintain Chinese software and hardware systems. And by the way, this also extends into the space domain, which we've seen China really throttle forward in recent years. Narrative framing. China presents its law enforcement cooperation as capacity building without political strings. And this contrasts, deeply with your U.S. military assistance, which is often portrayed as politically conditional. And then lastly, unlike U.S. programs, I think China training rarely incorporates human rights safeguards, potentially shifting police norms in more authoritarian directions. And I think why that's important is because the U.S. puts those constraints on anti-corruption, human rights. China engages without those constraints, which I think gives it opportunities to navigate in far more politically sensitive environments in which the United States can't necessarily engage. And so I don't think China's competing head on. It's showing up where the United States often chooses not. And so what does this mean for the United States in closing? GSI, in my opinion, is not displacing U.S. influence. However, it is highlighting areas where the U.S. has limited engagement, especially in the non-military domains. China is often willing to provide modest support in policing, crime prevention, cybersecurity, in digital governance at far more rapid and flexible ways than the United States. And I think these are areas where U.S. engagement is either minimal or constrained, but they matter to local governments. They matter to central governments. And so I think the U.S. should try not to mimic China, but it should recognize the demand for assistance beyond the military partnerships, and it needs to be more flexible and agile in its ability to deliver across the state if it wants to compete with that model from a global security architecture context. And so, Margaret, I'll lay my comments there, and I'll be happy to engage in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Brian. These are the absolutely critically important points and distinctions, especially at a moment when domestic security is top of mind for so many across the entire region. And really, this reminds me so much of the conversations that we had during COVID-19 when we were comparing U.S. models and Chinese models, and understanding that China wasn't doing more necessarily, right? But it was employing very different methods, strategies, and stepping in or filling gaps, perceived gaps in assistance. And so here we are again, and yet in a different domain. Although broadly conceived, this also would be interpreted as security assistance. I'd like to, just given the time, turn to some of the questions in the Q&A. There's one in here that really addresses kind of perceptions in the region of what China is doing, from Blaine Worthington, who writes, as China shifts to predicate development on security cooperation, or to link these two things, what are countries thinking about this? How are they reacting to it? And is there any evidence of backing away from either the Global Development Initiative or the GSI or the Belt and Road Initiative, given that there may be perceptions of strings attached or other concerns associated with these initiatives? And perhaps I can turn first to Andre for a regional perspective on this, and then perhaps also to Carla. Carla, if you have some thoughts on other regions and how they're interpreting these initiatives.
I think that there's varying perceptions on China in the region, and I think that there's still this ongoing narrative as China being a trustworthy partner that has no strings attached to it. I think that this just impacts on a lot of the population, and I think it also has to do with a lot of the dispute that we've had at a regional level regarding what is U.S. involvement in the region and how it's perceived, right? And that's also a very divisive line. So you have an not small portion of, I'm not even going to talk about general population, I'm going to talk about mostly people in the realm of decision making or policy informing that have a negative perception of U.S. involvement in the region. And almost automatically that translates into a positive perception of Chinese involvement, which many times erodes the critical capacity to notice the elements that we've been mentioning throughout this panel, right? And that's what makes it very complicated to deal with this discourse, because many times it's okay that China was willing to restrict the at JF-17 offered to the Argentine Air Force. If the US were to do it, then that'd be part of their imperialist attempt at suppressing military capacities of Argentina and corrosion of their national sovereignty, right? That's part of the discourse. So I think that that's one of the key elements to take into consideration on how perception continues to develop. I do think that with some of the changes in government in the region, especially with what we're seeing in Argentina, and again, I'm sorry about being so Argentina-centric, there is this changing perception on Chinese involvement, but it's not so much conditioned because of how China is perceived in the region. It's more conditioned by how Argentines are willing to perceive themselves in the world, right? And that implies a shift towards West.
Thank you so much, Andre. Carla, any thoughts?
Thanks. No, this is a really key question, and it is, I think, where China has the longest kind of security cooperation in Southeast Asia and also Central Asia. You're seeing, some concerns about China's growing security role, and that's partly because it's paired with proximity, geographic proximity, and also just the great weight of the Chinese economy and many of these economies. And so increasing dependence on China for security is a concern. But I think the appeal of GSI, as both Xiaoyu and Brian highlighted, is really in that it is tailored to strengthen regime security, domestic security, and this reflects China's own priorities, and so it does have a lot of appeal. That said, there are, I think, all of the countries in Southeast Asia, particularly those with strains with and even disputes with China over sovereignty and so on, have been very, very cautious about embracing the GSI, and have been also concerned about becoming too dependent on China's policing support. For example, China's cooperating a good deal with Thailand, but Thailand is also very cautious about excessive cooperation with China. And we had recent conflict between Cambodia and Thailand, and Cambodia, of course, is very, very close to Thailand. So this is a complex environment, and countries are very aware of this. And the same is true in Central Asia, where after a long history of overwhelming security dominance by Russia, the Soviet Union, these countries are very cautious about deepening security ties to an extent where they would become dependencies on China. Although they're also appealed to by all the goodies that China can offer, from the safe cities, surveillance systems, and so on, because they have very real security issues that they need to address. And China provides a lot of these big packages at reasonably low cost, and has been quite a reliable partner in these areas. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Carla. I'm going to try and bridge a couple of the questions in here, combine them if I can. In general, for anyone who would like to respond here, what next steps would you advise U.S. policymakers to take in looking to engage in ways that will be competitive with this new vision, right, or emerging and evolving vision that China is articulating, which in part, at least, as Xiaoyu noted, is intended to delegitimize, U.S. approaches and definitions of security cooperation and assistance of a primarily traditional security-minded approach to engagement with the region. What can be done? We've heard that that there are these critical distinctions, and that indeed much of what China is doing, it does align well with local interests. What next steps would you advise? And then, in addition to that, to try and bridge these two, how, and this is for Brian specifically, called out in the questions, how do you see the GSI balancing regional priorities with global strategic goals when operating in the Latin American context? And anyone else is, of course, welcome to comment on that as well. So a little bit of this notion of co-production, right? How are the demand factors impacting maybe how the GSI is articulating in the region? So perhaps we could start. Yes, please, Brian.
No, I'll start since I got called out on that last question. Let me jump in and provide just really a short answer. I think in the region, sort of China aligns local priorities with Beijing's global initiatives by framing cooperation around shared principles like sovereignty, development, non-interference, while embedding these in economic and security partnerships like GSI. I think through integration products, China has addressed regional needs such as infrastructure, public security, resource development, while protecting its own strategic investments and securing critical supply chains. I did type an answer to that one in the Q&A. Someone asked about strategic mining, so I responded. If it was you, I responded. And so I think the approach supports China's vertical integration. And Margot, we talked about this in the past. Look at BYD and lithium, sort of exploiting lithium from the region or leveraging lithium from the region is less about the lithium and more about having finished products that it can, export globally through BYD. And I think that advances its broader, goals of reshaping global governance norms in ways that enhance its influence and strategic positioning globally.
Fantastic. Thank you. Anyone, any thoughts on next steps in U.S. policy? Xiaoyu.
As a university-based scholar, I don't have a practical solution or advice, but I have more of a sort of philosophical advice for U.S. government in a sense that even see China as a serious competitor. Don't try to become another China. In a sense that it's not a symmetrical competition. Also don't lose confidence. The United States has enormous confidence, enormous capability in traditional military, in other domains. So China certainly pose some challenges in the security domain, this kind of new concept. But there's something China can do the United States can never do, or can never do the same way. So I think even we think about there's some sort of competition, don't imagine, okay, the United States have to compete dollar by dollar, issue by issue, everything match China. I don't think that's a viable solution. So instead of thinking about that, think about more of a symmetrical competition. The United States still focus on whatever domains the United States could have some advantages. Meanwhile, think about managing some practical challenges from China, but also have a little bit more empathy with local actors in Latin America, because it's not everything is about the U.S.-China zero-sum competition in the region. It's if the United States want to build a long-term relationship with Latin American countries, it's important to show some sort of empathy with local countries, local actors. I think that's again, this is not like a practical solution, but
a
yeah.
critically important point. Xiaoyu, thank you so much for that. Andre.
I think that the one recurring thing that I hear sometimes when we're having this discussion on, the U.S. and Chinese involvement in countries in the region has to do with, you hear the criticism of what I was mentioning before. In Argentina, provinces have a great level of autonomy to deal on issues that are of strategic level, like mining and extractive rights. And, that's a problem. And I think that part of the problem is thinking that that's a problem. It's not an issue of if Argentina has this legal framework or not, and that helps the Chinese compete in that legal framework, is how the United States should be competing in the same space. And, the other days here in Argentina, the future ambassador from the United States to Argentina, Lamelas, he caught a lot of flack because he went out and he said exactly this. We have to go and engage with the provinces and the businesses at a provincial level, not just the national government. Maybe he put it in terms that didn't sound as nice to the local populace, but, that's exactly what U.S. competitors are doing in the region. That's what U.S. should be doing, right? So that's on one side. That's on like what should be done in country. On the other side, many times, and this has to do also with another question regarding how the Chinese can compete in like military sales, and I think this is for security military sales. Many times the Chinese not only offer relatively good quality products, they offer financing, better prices, and little restrictions on what they're willing to sell, right? And these last 2 points are the most important ones for, if the United States is not going to be able to compete on a price point on a lot of the technology. What they are able to offer many times is better technology, better support for the systems, facilitating financing to those acquisitions would be key, and sometimes reducing the restrictions. I'm not talking about, I'm talking about more operational restrictions. Sometimes has to do with export controls on certain materials that are not as sensitive as sometimes we perceive them to be. Of course, at some point that was very important, but if the Chinese are willing to offer similar technology with no restrictions, then maybe that's one point in which the United States should really reconsider if those controls are being effective or if they're even worth it, right?
Thank you so much, Andre. Brian, did you have a
Yeah, I mean, look, I think Xiaoyu and Andre are absolutely spot on. On one end, the U.S. Should be careful not to emulate the Chinese model. I don't think the U.S. has any intent of doing that, but I do think the U.S. needs to find greater alignment in terms of how it engages the region across all of the different dimensions of the security landscape. I think it's critical for us to get that right and have better alignment. Not necessarily overwhelmingly shifting authorities, but creating better alignment between the authorities in the U.S. that deliver that security assistance. I think that's vital. One of the most important elements of security cooperation is what we call threat centricity, right? And that means that the U.S. and our partners understand and have a common appreciation for the security threat that they're dealing with. And I think that should continue to drive American cooperation, because I think that's what Latin American partners are asking for, is to help them with their issues, not necessarily with the US's interests. And so if we can find that threat centricity across the broader, traditional landscape, I think that's vital. I agree with Andre. We need better flexibility and agility in our ability to deliver. We can't do it without restrictions, because I think the United States has to be careful not to overwhelmingly compromise some of the important values that have long-term implications in the region, like corruption and human rights. And so it needs to continue to stay engaged in that space. That said, it still has to engage. If it's not on the field, then someone else is going to fill that space. And so even in the backdrop of human rights and corruption, the U.S. has to be on the field engaging, and has to continue to constructively engage against its values, and not sacrifice those in ways that maybe Chinese engagement sort of remains apolitical on them. And I think we need to ensure that alignment as well.
Thank you so much, Brian. That is a terrific point, and a really good one to end on. We have come to the end of our discussion. Unfortunately, I think we could go on for quite some time. So hopefully there'll be much more to come on this and other issues related to the China-Latin America relationship. This has been an enormously enjoyable, I think, and critically important and timely discussion, bridging the conceptual and the operational, right, and a real understanding of how the GSI is evolving and manifesting in the Latin American region and beyond. I can't thank you all enough for your tremendous contributions to this discussion. Thank you all in the audience for joining us and for your great questions. We touched on many, not all, and I apologize for that, but please do stay engaged with us, and we'll look forward to producing more content on this topic. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.